Thank you very much, Professor Spillmann, for this introduction, and also to the Academia Engelberg for inviting me here to this very interesting conference. And I think it's somehow a pity that we have to turn to a very different topic, because I also would have liked to follow some thoughts of Professor Hamburger and his brilliant talk. Just one remark to this discussion that happened here 5 minutes ago, and the question why there is always this kind of principal difference between philosophers' approaches to certain topics and the approaches of other disciplines. The sociologist Norbert Elias once said in a discussion with a philosopher, Philosophen sind Menschen, die vergessen haben, dass alle Erwachsenen mal Kinder waren. And many of the philosophical concepts are really based on the idea that adult persons meet each other, get into interactions with each other, have all these problems of Alter and ego and things, and forget the simple fact that each human was always together with others, and its whole development is depending on the interaction with others. So somehow this kind of fight reflects something like an over-individualized concept of humans, especially in modern societies, because modern societies provide their members with a self-image of being highly individualized. But on an empirical level, and this shows developmental psychology, none of us is an individual in the sense we experience ourselves as an individual, but in terms of development, but also in terms of social existence, we are through and through social, and there is not much individual about what we are doing. So, and this is also a bridge to what I'm talking about, the aspect of, or the puzzling result that in the context of mass crimes or societal crimes, we find many people who would have never thought of themselves that they could become murderers or perpetrators, violent actors, but find themselves in situations where they decide very easily to kill other people and don't have much problems in interpreting what they are doing and keeping a self-concept as a good guy, although they do very bad things. And the question, the guiding question for, to my research in this field is exactly, we wouldn't have any problem if we could interpret or explain mass crimes or evil social processes if they were done by evil people. The problem we have is that all these things are done by good people. So in some way, Gerhard Roth yesterday talked about the 5% of really evil people because they have some kind of pathological disorders and things like that. And I'm talking about the remaining 95% who don't have these deficits, but are as normal as me or you or whoever, but would do the most unnormal things in certain situations. So one remark on violence. I think in a type of society we are living in and we have been socialized in, violence seems to be something like an explainable behavior, or a behavior that requires explanation. But I think this is somehow wrong, because violence was always an option of social behavior or social action. It never has disappeared from the variety of social actions. It just changes formats. And in societies we live in, we have this great achievement of civilization that we have a monopoly of violence use. This is the very important thing, because this provides all the security and freedom we have and we live in. But this doesn't mean that violence has disappeared. It just means violence has another format, and this format can change also to another level again. So it's never something that is fixed or achieved in the civilization processes, but as again Norbert Elias said, it can also de-civilize and take another format. So violence is always an option. Violence is always there. And the second remark on violence in itself I want to make is that we misunderstand violence if we see it as a destructive kind of action, as a destructive means of some instrumental interest or something. Violence is destructive for the victims, but for the perpetrators, at least it appears as something highly constructive, because violence is used if people want to fulfill certain goals, if they want to follow certain interests, and violence changes realities. Most of the time in the sense that perpetrators want to have the reality changed. So violence is used because people feel it is a constructive means to achieve something. So violence also is not senseless or meaningless, but it has meaning, amongst other qualities, that it is a performative way of social action, that is telling something, it is narrating something. All these qualities of violence are not really matched if we think about of violence in kind of normative terms or moralistic terms. I know that this is a very difficult field, but to see it in this way, it is not so puzzling why people use violence, not on an individual level and not on a societal level. And it has always been used to follow certain interests or to achieve certain goals. So now to my problem, why would people decide to kill even if they have a self-concept that would have made them think 2 or 3 months before that they would never decide to kill anybody or not even to harm anybody. So a complete surprising task. And my fields of research are historical fields. So I investigated different genocides. And of course, the most important and the most puzzling in many respects is the German extermination war and the Holocaust. Because here we have the perfect example that perfectly normal people kill others without personal motives, but maybe for other motives. And it's very difficult to analyze this because we can't interview these people. Most of them are dead now. The others, there are very few who would report about what they had done. So we have only few sources to reconstruct the situations that were there and the people acted in. And the interesting thing about mass murdering processes, massacres, societal crimes, is first of all that we don't have a single case in history where a genocide stopped because there weren't enough killers. This is an interesting thing. It sounds a bit weird, but it's very interesting. All kinds of mass crimes find enough persons who would decide to kill others. How is this possible? So what is the potentiality in normal social situations, in normal persons, to follow certain paths that are opened because of a rapidly processing social situation? And to investigate something like this, on the example of the historical case of the Third Reich and the Holocaust, I would differ 3 different levels of analysis. One is the societal level, because people don't act in a vacuum. They act within normative frameworks. And what is also interesting is that these normative frameworks can rapidly change. Things that we are taken for granted, like we know what is good and bad, we know what is just and unjust, and all these things can, as for example the Third Reich shows, shift in a very short amount of time. So if we talk about the people who became killers from the middle of 1941 on, if we think of them acting in a normative framework that would be the same as ours, is completely wrong. We have to take in respect that in the 8 years that that there was a development in the 8 years before 1941 where the whole societal normative model changed from a modern society based on Western Christian norms of equality and things like that, changed to a principle unequal concept of society. This is a very important thing. And this was managed not by orders of the regime, but this was managed by a rapidly changing social process where each member of the included group, the Volksgemeinschaft, changed their attitudes and perceptions towards the others, the outgroup, in this case the Jews and other defined groups that were not belonging to the Volksgemeinschaft. And if you reconstruct the process, how this moved on, you can find every step that you would find also in other social adaptation processes. That at first, in the years 32, 33, 34, the Nazi ideology seemed strange to many of the people. But the changing of the reality, all these famous narratives and tales about youth unemployment was solved, Autobahnen have been built, and things like that. It's not a ridiculous thing. It's something that appeared in the experience of the contemporaries really as achievements. So that this ideology didn't remain as an ideology, but something as a developing, as an unfolding project where people could participate in. So if we do interviews with so-called contemporary witnesses, you still find, independently if the people are completely anti-national socialist or very critic to their personal history and things like that, you will always find this kind of emotional traces of being part of a project, as long as they belong to the Volksgemeinschaft. If they belong to the excluded part, the narratives are, of course, totally different. But just to mention it very briefly, we have to take this recoding of a normative model into respect to understand why people would act in the situation in 1941 in the way they acted. There's a normative model that has a principal idea of basic inequality of people, and of course of that people have different rights and can easily be treated and normatively legitimately treated in a different way. So and there's another level. This is the level of the social group where the perpetrators belong to, and the third level is the individual level. And this individual level that has to do, of course, then with the biography or the psychology of the perpetrators is only interesting if we have the ideal situation that two people in exactly the same situation act totally differently. This is the only or the first situation where psychology becomes interesting. If they don't, we can keep to the social situation and try to figure out which factors of these situations made the people to do what they did. And the approach of a social psychologist is to reconstruct what the actors saw, what the people in the situation saw. Because humans don't act upon objective circumstances. They always make perceptions of the situation they find themselves in, then they make interpretations of these perceptions, and then they draw conclusions, and then they act and decide something to do. So the perception of the situation can be completely irrational or wrong. Nevertheless, what they do is establishing certain realities. This is the famous Thomas theorem that says if persons perceive situations as real, they are real in their consequences. So to understand why they did something, we have to reconstruct their perspectives, which is a dangerous thing if we talk about perpetrators. And when I started to do this work, I had great trouble in explaining what they saw, because then there was, of course, this normative accusations. As soon as you reconstruct what the perpetrator saw, you would try to follow their perspectives, to this great German problem with Verständnis and Verstehen that is brought together in this, or mixed up in this process. But we have to understand what they saw, otherwise we cannot understand why they did what they did. And if we do something like this, we come to really surprising results. We know from the research of historians that in terms of social backgrounds, socialization processes, religious convictions, gender, age, life age, and things like that, we would find no group in the whole German society that would have been kind of immune to this killing processes. Also, education is not a discriminating factor. The commanders of the Einsatzgruppen, the killing units, had all doctor titles, two of them too. They would have been performing perfectly on conferences like this because they had this interdisciplinary qualifications, being a physician and a philosopher and things like that. But these were not perpetrators sitting in Berlin and giving orders, but they were there directly on the killing fields, and sometimes to perform as good commanders, they would kill by hand by themselves to give their men examples. So education is not a discriminating, not a protective factor in this field. And we have this reserve police battalions to investigate how normal people come to decide killing others, because the reserve police battalions are really an interesting group consisting of men between 30 and 40 years old with an age of development and socialization before National Socialism, having some civil profession, not being professional policemen but reserve policemen, having no experience in fighting because they were not part of the combat troops, but were just police troops to secure the villages that were in the occupied territories. And exactly these reserve police battalions took place in these mass killings. And there's one famous police battalion, or in this negative sense, famous police battalion that was investigated by Christopher Browning. It's the Hamburg Reserve Police Battalion 101. And in my book, I took the sources to Reserve Police Battalion 45, which is very similar in terms of the social structure and things like that. All these people are not Weltanschauungskrieger. They are not even party members or things like that. They're quite normal people, but they participated in killings like in Babi Yar, where these police battalions managed to kill 32,000 people within 2 days. 500 men and some other additional people to this. So this is something that needs to be explained. And coming back to what people expect, which is part of the perceptions of a situation, we have to say that these policemen didn't expect to become members of killing units. They expected that they had to fight against partisans, or that they had to secure the villages, that they had to maybe arrest some people or something like this, but it was not part of the self-concept and self-expectation to kill thousands of other people, defenseless people, or women, or kids, or something like this. So there's a very interesting situation when we can reconstruct the situation of where they were giving these orders to kill. And we have very good material for the first situation where the 500 men of Police Battalion 101 were giving the order to kill. And I just will repeat this very briefly because, in my point of view, this is very instructive. In this case, this battalion consists of 500 men. They have been there in the east, in the occupied territories for a few months, weren't part in mass killings up to this point. And the commander of this battalion, his name is Wilhelm Trapp, is a person over the age of 50, a very non-military guy. He's a very weak person. He is very open and frank to his men. He would listen if they have some problems and things like that. They call him Papa Trapp. Some call him Opa Trapp, which says something about the relationship between the man and this commander. And there's this morning where this Wilhelm Trapp steps in front of his battalion, which is standing there, these 500 men, and says the following: "Today I have to give you a terrible order." And it's reported that he is emotionally very aroused, that he seems to be puzzled, that he has tears in his eyes, and he's giving the order saying, "I have to give you a terrible order." And then he would explain, maybe some of you will have difficulties to fulfill this task. Maybe it's easier if you think about your families at home, because we do this to prevent them from being treated badly or killed. But if this doesn't help, you may step out and you don't have to participate. This is the first documented case where it is documented that they were free to choose this man. And the result is quite interesting, because from this 500 men, between 6 and 11 took this offer and stepped out. This means 489 decided to kill. But did they decide to kill? What is the situation? If we now try to reconstruct what these people experienced in this situation, maybe we get another picture. Maybe it's not about a decision to kill. Maybe it's something totally different. So if we look how this Wilhelm Trapp performed his order giving, it's something quite interesting what he does. When he says, "I have a terrible order to give to you," he is distancing himself from the order he's giving. He says, if I would be able to choose, I would never give you something. I find this terrible. I find this awful. He performs any sign of distance to this. He's almost about crying, things like that. So there's a relationship between every single of this 500 men and this commander whom they like. So there's this commander who would say, "I have extreme difficulties in giving you this order." Would this lead to something like letting him go and step out and say, "Do whatever you want, you can have your problems, I don't care about it"? Or is it something like an appeal to norms of solidarity? Is it something to maintain the social relationship between this nice commander and his men? And the same applies to the relationship between the men who are standing there. Because what people do in a situation like this is always they say the same. They look at each other. Because you have to imagine that this is a complete unclear situation. What does it mean to take part in a so-called Judenaktion? They don't have an experience. They have heard rumors about it, but they don't have any idea how this would look like. What is required from them? What is their task and things like that? So it's a situation of very low orientation and high insecurity. What people do in situations of low orientation and high insecurity is doing nothing, looking at each other, seeking orientation, what the others will do. So it's something like a self-enhancing process. So they look at each other. And then there are very simple factors if we bring it down to the very low level of social action. Stepping out is an active thing. Keeping standing there doesn't require anything. So it's much more likely in a situation of low orientation that people won't do nothing in a situation like this. But this is a decision nevertheless. Then you have a social situation that is defined by the relationship between the man and the commander and amongst the men themselves. Victims are not there. Victims are not part of the decision situation. They don't play any role. And it's even unclear at what time this Judenaktion will take place, if it's in 3 days or 1 week or whatever. They are not part of the social situation. So they don't appear. All kinds of normative reasoning, who will this be? Will this be unjust? Will this be bad? Or things like that, are not categories that appear in the immediate social situation. This is defined by the direct social relations between the person, and there are norms of solidarity, there are norms of normal social standards and things like that. Another point is that these people are not at home. They are not in Hamburg. They don't have contact with their wives or kids or whatever. So there's not a correction from the social reference group. The only social reference group are these people who are there, these 500 men, for an unexpected time. How long will we be together with them? To harm social norms in a social situation like this is very dangerous. It's extremely dangerous. We talk about abstract terms like group norms or things like that, but this is very concrete in every situation. So what would it mean to step out? Harming norms of solidarity, because it's clear that the order has to be fulfilled. That means the dirty work has to be done by the others. Please, you do it, I don't. What would that mean for the following month for these persons? And things like that. So if we take this perspective and try to reconstruct what these people saw, it is much more understandable that they would keep standing in the row and not step out. And I did this example, discussed this example several times with students, and I always did divided the cupboard, and on the one side there was standing reasons to step out, and the other ones was reason to keep standing there. And it was quite interesting because the students were very good in filling one side of the table, and the other one remained almost empty. There were just 2 or 3 things: ethics, morality, religion, religious beliefs or something like this. But we know from social psychology that these abstract factors are not very important in the immediate social situations where people are confronted in fulfilling certain tasks and what they interpret what their tasks are. Morality is something that comes afterwards when they try to explain what they've done, but not in the immediate situation, or very rarely. So I keep it with this example and make just a very brief remarks on what happens then. Because what happens then when they take part in the first killings, they have difficulties in doing this. But we have to understand, and this was also mentioned yesterday after Gerhard Roth's talk, I don't want to sound cynical, but it's important to notice that killing thousands of people is a complicated process to do it, and they don't know how to do it technically. They have no idea because they never did it before. And what these killing units do is experimenting the best way how to kill. Is it better to bring all the victims to the killing sites, or to bring them sequentially? How is the time structure between taking them out of their houses and bringing them to the killing fields? Is it better to take off the clothes before killing or afterwards? What kind of weapons have to be used? And all these things. I know it sounds very cynical, but this is what these people experience as their tasks and to make decisions upon. And they experimented. So to call it, to name it in the terms of organizational or organizational sociology, would say we would have here a process of divided labor, because all the people are participating in different parts of these change of divided labors. There are people who drive the trucks, there are people who prepare the killing grounds, there are people who bring the weapons, and there are also people who would perform these direct killings. And then something interesting also happens, that people first take part into killings, and then they feel they feel it's completely ugly, and they say, I can't do it. So they would step out, and even these people don't face any formal problems. They are then named Weichei or Scheißkerl or something like this, but they won't face any formal consequences. And others who have been reluctant in killing try to do it and things like that. So you can reconstruct over the months and years a process of professionalization of killing. And as in any kind of complex task with long chains of different tasks to fulfill, division of labor, you will always find that people would never think about the aim of the whole project, but they would always think about their specific task and how to solve problems that pop up in this specific task. So it's not a division of labor, but also a division of responsibility. And in this respect, it's not so difficult to explain why they did it, although what they did was committing the greatest crime mankind ever saw. Because they constantly solve problems, they make experience with it, they professionalize themselves, and they reason about in the evening when they drink and whatever, was this good, was this bad, did we do it good, did people suffer too much or not, and things like that. And this is also adjusting them back to their self-concept as people who won't act as killing machines, but people who would talk about problems they have with it, how they solve these problems and things like that. I don't have the time to go into these details of this, but this is a very, very important and striking thing. And I just can give you the information that all these analyses are built on ego materials like autobiographies, but mainly on Ermittlungsakten, because when people were interrogated, investigated as witnesses in these crimes, they made these kinds of reports, and you can find many of their interpretations of the immediate situation after the fact, and can reinterpret it in the way to reconstruct what they saw. But now we have something. Since 1 year we do a project which is based on a really incredible material, because what people didn't know until recently is that the Americans, the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service, as the British intelligence service, screened the conversations of the German prisoners of war when they were in the camps. Screening, die haben sie abgehört. I don't know what the word of this is. They taped their conversations. And we have 150,000 pages of transcripts of these conversations. And they didn't know that they were screened. So they thought, we can talk, and they have a lot of time to talk. So we have now material about how these killing processes were perceived by the persons. So for example, I quote it in German. I also have an English translation, but maybe it's more interesting. For example, Fritz Swoboda, born in 1922, was member of the Waffen-SS and is talking to his comrade in the camp about the mass killings. And says, da waren doch Erschießungen am laufenden Band, da gab es die 12 Mark Zulage, 120 Kronen am Tag für die Erschießungskommandos. Da haben wir nichts anderes gemacht, also die Gruppen von 12 Mann haben jeweils 6 Mann geführt und dann umgelegt. Da habe ich vielleicht 14 Tage nichts anderes gemacht. Dann haben wir doppelte Verpflegung gekriegt, weil das doch ungeheuer die Nerven kostet. Frauen haben wir auch erschossen, die Frauen waren besser wie die Männer. Männer haben wir viele gesehen, auch Juden, die gewimmert haben im letzten Augenblick. Such conversations are really something like real-time ego materials about the experiences of killing, but not only about this, but how all these processes were organized and how they were perceived. And you find these aspects of the interpretation as a dirty work that was difficult to do. Nothing about we liked it a lot, and this is also an important thing because it was never explained or designed by the commanders, by the SS, not even by Himmler, as a work that people should like to do. And this, again, made it easier to do for them because they could experience themselves as people who suffer under the dirty work they have to do despite of the better moral self-concept. So morality plays a very different role in this way of killings. These are not amoral killers, but these are people who are able to kill because they can reassure themselves about a functioning moral self-concept. I think this is over the time anyway, so thank you very much.